Hi, I'm Maya. 3 years ago, my parents looked me straight in the eye and told me I was dead to them. They believed every twisted lie my sister Cassandra spun without asking a single question. That night, I walked out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of rage they mistook for guilt. They thought they were protecting their golden child from her troubled sister. Now Cassandra's behind bars for fraud. My parents lost their house last month, and I'm the CEO of a company worth more than they'll ever see again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started on a Tuesday evening in November, one of those crisp autumn nights in Portland when the rain hadn't started yet, but you could smell it coming. I remember parking my beat-up Honda outside my childhood home, the yellow porch light flickering like it had been doing for months. Dad had texted me earlier that afternoon asking me to come by for dinner. Nothing unusual, just a simple family meal, he said. I thought maybe Mom had finally decided to make her famous lasagna again. Or perhaps they wanted to talk about Thanksgiving plans. But when I pushed through the front door, the house felt different. Too quiet. Too staged. The living room was arranged like a courtroom, with Mom and Dad sitting stiffly on the couch, and Cassandra perched on the edge of the recliner, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the armrest. No smell of garlic bread in the oven. No table set for four. Just 3 pairs of eyes staring at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong house. "Maya?" Dad said without getting up, his voice carrying that tone he used when he was about to deliver bad news. "We need to have a serious conversation." I hung my jacket on the coat rack by the door, already feeling the shift in energy. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The family photos on the mantel seemed to be watching me, waiting for whatever bomb was about to drop. "Okay," I said slowly, choosing the chair across from them. "What's going on?" Cassandra spoke first, and I should have known right then that this was her show. "Maya, we know what you've been doing." Her voice was steady, practiced, like she'd rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. "We know about the money." My stomach dropped. "What money?" Mom finally looked up from her lap, her eyes red-rimmed and disappointed. "The money you've been stealing from our business account. The money you've been using for drugs." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that seemed to echo in the too quiet room. "Are you serious right now? Drugs? Stealing?" Dad pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. He set it on the coffee table between us like evidence in a trial. "Bank statements, Maya. Withdrawals made with your debit card. We found the receipts in your old room." I leaned forward, grabbing the top sheet. It was a bank statement from our family's small catering business, the one Mom and Dad had built from nothing over 20 years. Highlighted in yellow were several withdrawals, each for $300 or $400, all made within the past 2 months. My debit card number was listed clear as day. "This is impossible," I whispered, scanning the dates. "I haven't touched the business account since I helped with the books last summer. And drugs? Mom, when have you ever seen me high? When have I ever given you reason to think—" "Don't lie to us anymore," Cassandra interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I saw you, Maya, last week behind the CVS on Morrison. You were buying pills from some guy in a hoodie. Cash transaction." The room started spinning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Cassie, I was never behind any CVS. Last week I was working double shifts at the bookstore because Mrs. Henderson was out sick. You can call and verify that." "We already did," Mom said quietly. "She said you called in sick on Wednesday." I stared at her, my mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "That's not true. I worked Wednesday. I worked every day last week." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt creeping into their faces wasn't doubt at all. It was certainty. They had already made up their minds before I walked through that door. This wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. Cassandra reached into her purse and pulled out a small plastic baggie with white residue clinging to the inside. I found this in your car yesterday when you let me borrow it. The baggie landed on the coffee table next to the bank statements, like the final piece of evidence in their case against me. I stared at it, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. That's not mine. Cassie, you know that's not mine. You know me better than anyone. She shrugged, and in that casual gesture, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Satisfaction. She was enjoying this. Maya, Dad said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine grief. Your mother and I have been talking for weeks. We've watched you change over the past year. The mood swings, the secrecy, the way you've been pulling away from family events. I've been working 2 jobs and trying to save money for my own place, I protested. That's not pulling away, that's being responsible. Responsible people don't steal from their parents, Mom said, finally meeting my eyes. Responsible people don't develop drug habits and lie about it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. These were the people who had raised me, who had supposedly loved me unconditionally. And they were sitting here, looking at fabricated evidence, listening to lies from my own sister, and choosing to believe the worst possible version of who I was. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. So what happens now? Do I get a chance to defend myself? Do I get to show you my work schedule? My bank statements? My clean drug test from the physical I had last month? Dad shook his head. We've made our decision, Maya. We think it's best if you find somewhere else to live while you get your life together. Find somewhere else to live? The words came out as a whisper. You're kicking me out? We're giving you a chance to get clean and figure things out, Mom said, but she couldn't look at me when she said it. We'll keep paying your phone bill for now, but we need you out of the house tonight. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of the 3 people who were supposed to love me most in the world. Dad looked resigned, like he was doing something necessary but unpleasant. Mom looked heartbroken but determined. And Cassandra looked like she was trying very hard not to smile. Tonight? I repeated. Your bags are already packed, Cassandra said, gesturing toward the hallway. I put them by the front door. That's when it hit me, the planning, the coordination, the way they were all sitting here waiting for me, prepared with evidence and speeches and my belongings already bagged up. This wasn't a spontaneous intervention. This was an execution that had been planned for days, maybe weeks. I walked to the front door in a daze. 3 duffel bags sat in a neat row, stuffed with what looked like a random selection of my clothes and belongings. No care had been taken in the packing. My favorite sweater was wrinkled and shoved in with old shoes. Books I'd treasured since childhood were missing entirely. The car stays here, Dad called from the living room. It's in our name. Of course it was. I pulled out my phone and called the first number I could think of, my friend Rachel from work. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cheerful until she heard mine. Maya? What's wrong? Can you pick me up? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I need a place to stay tonight. She didn't ask questions, just said she'd be there in 20 minutes. I spent those 20 minutes sitting on the front porch steps, staring at the street I'd grown up on, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Cars drove by with their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, families probably heading home to normal dinners and normal conversations. When Rachel's car pulled up, I grabbed my bags and walked away from the only home I'd ever known without looking back. I couldn't bear to see if anyone was watching me leave through the window. Rachel drove in silence for the first few minutes, letting me collect myself. Finally, she glanced over and said, "You want to talk about it?" I told her everything. Every accusation, every piece of fake evidence, every moment of that nightmare conversation. She listened without interrupting, her jaw getting tighter with each detail. "Maya," she said when I finished, "you know this is insane, right? Your parents have known you your entire life. How could they believe you'd suddenly become a drug addict and a thief?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. That night, lying on Rachel's couch with a borrowed blanket pulled up to my chin, I stared at the ceiling and tried to piece together how my life had imploded in the span of 2 hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Cassandra's face, that barely concealed satisfaction when she dropped the baggie on the table. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "We love you, Maya. Please get the help you need." I turned off the phone and didn't turn it back on for 3 days. During those 3 days, I did something I'd never done before in my 23 years of life. I started investigating my own family. Rachel let me use her laptop, and I began going through every financial record I could access, every social media post, every piece of digital evidence I could find. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The debit card transactions that had been highlighted on those bank statements? They all happened on days when Cassandra had borrowed my car. She'd been using my debit card, which had access to the family business account because I'd helped with bookkeeping, to make withdrawals, while I was at work. But it was more than that. Going back through months of records, I found a pattern of small thefts that had been happening long before the big withdrawals that got me kicked out. Money disappearing from Mom's purse, Dad's credit card being used, for online purchases he didn't make. Small amounts, spread out over time, always when Cassandra was around. The CVS story was brilliant in its simplicity. She'd been there, making the drug buy, and simply claimed it was me. Who would believe the accused over the accuser, especially when the accused was supposedly high and desperate? And the baggie in my car? Elementary. She'd planted it when she borrowed my Honda the day before the family meeting, knowing exactly when and how she'd reveal it for maximum impact. Rachel found me crying over the laptop on Thursday morning, surrounded by printed bank statements and credit card records. "She's been robbing them blind for months," I whispered, "and she set me up to take the fall. Maya, you have to show your parents this." I shook my head. They won't believe me. They've already made up their minds about who I am. But Rachel was persistent. She helped me organize all the evidence into a clear timeline. We printed everything out, highlighted the patterns, and created a presentation that would make the truth impossible to ignore. On Friday afternoon, I called Dad. "Maya?" His voice was careful, cautious. "I need to show you something," I said. "Something important about the money and about Cassandra. Honey, if you're ready to admit you have a problem and get help—" "Dad, please, just give me 30 minutes. I have evidence that will change everything." There was a long pause. "Evidence of what?" "Evidence that I didn't steal anything, and evidence of who did." He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. When I walked in carrying a thick folder of documents, he looked older than I remembered, worn down by the stress of the past week. I didn't waste time with small talk. I spread the papers across the table between us and started explaining. The pattern of thefts, the correlation between Cassandra's movements and the missing money, the timeline that proved I was at work every time my debit card was supposedly being used. Dad's face went through a series of expressions as he processed what I was showing him. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, horror. "This can't be right," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Check the dates, Dad. Cross-reference them with Cassandra's work schedule, with the times she borrowed my car, with the days she was alone in the house. It's all there." He spent 20 minutes going through every document, making notes, asking questions. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were filled with a pain that was different from the disappointment I'd seen earlier that week. Maya, if this is true, it's true. And Dad, there's more. I pulled out my phone and showed him screenshots from Cassandra's social media accounts. Photos of expensive clothes, jewelry, and restaurant meals that she couldn't afford on. Her part-time salary at the boutique, Venmo transactions between her and people I didn't recognize, always for round numbers that suggested drug deals. She's not just stealing from you and Mom, I said quietly. She's using. Everything she accused me of, she's actually doing. Dad put his head in his hands. For a long moment, we sat in silence while the coffee shop buzzed with normal conversation. Around us. Finally, he looked up. We need to go home. We need to show your mother. And we need to confront Cassandra. The ride back to the house was silent. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could see him rehearsing what he was going to say. When we pulled into the driveway, Cassandra's car was there, which meant she was home from work. Mom was in the kitchen when we walked in, and her face lit up when she saw me. Maya, are you ready to talk about getting help? Mom, Dad said, his voice strained. We need to sit down. All of us. There's something Maya needs to show us. The confrontation that followed was nothing like the staged intervention from earlier that week. This time, the evidence was real. The accusations were true. And the person being cornered was Cassandra. She denied everything at first, her voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. But as Dad methodically went through each piece of evidence, each connection, each lie she'd told, her denials became weaker and more desperate. Finally, when Mom pulled out her phone and started calling the bank to verify the debit card usage, Cassandra broke. Okay, fine, she screamed, jumping up from the couch. I took some money, but Maya's not innocent either. She's always been Dad's favorite, always getting the opportunities I never got. The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mom's phone slipped from her fingers. Dad stared at his younger daughter like he'd never seen her before. Some money? I said, finding my voice for the first time since we'd started this conversation. Cassie, you stole thousands of dollars. You planted drugs in my car. You lied to destroy my relationship with our parents. I needed the money, she shot back. Do you know what it's like being the screw-up sister? Do you know what it's like watching everyone expect you to fail while perfect Maya gets praised? For everything? Mom stood up slowly, her face pale. Cassandra, you let us kick your sister out of her home. You watched us break our hearts over what we thought she'd become. How could you do that to family? But Cassandra was already grabbing her purse, heading for the door. Don't act like you care about family now. You chose Maya over me the second she walked in here with her little presentation. She slammed the door so hard that the family photos on the mantel rattled. In the silence that followed, I looked at my parents and saw two people who had just realized they'd made the most devastating mistake of their lives. Dad's shoulders were shaking. Mom was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. Maya, Dad whispered, I am so sorry. The apology hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. Dad's face was streaked with tears I'd never seen him shed, and Mom looked like someone had physically struck her. But I couldn't let their remorse wash away what had happened. I couldn't let sorry be enough. I know you are, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But apologizing doesn't undo the fact that you chose to believe the worst about me without hesitation. It doesn't erase the fact that you packed my bags like I was garbage to be thrown out. Rachel had been texting me throughout the confrontation, checking in every hour to make sure I was okay. When I finally responded that night, telling her Cassandra had confessed and fled, she called me immediately. Maya, this is insane, she said, her voice tight with anger. Your own sister framed you for drug addiction and theft. What kind of person does that? I was sitting in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by belongings that had been hastily thrown back where they came from. Everything felt foreign now, like I was staying in a stranger's house. The kind of person who resents you so much that destroying your life feels like victory. Are your parents pressing charges? I looked out my window toward the driveway where Cassandra's parking spot sat empty. I don't know. We haven't talked about it yet. Everyone's still processing. But even as I said it, I knew that processing time was a luxury I couldn't afford. Cassandra was out there somewhere, probably planning her next move. And if there was one thing I'd learned about my sister in the past week, it was that she was far more calculating than any of us had realized. The next morning, I woke up to voices coming from the kitchen. Mom and Dad were talking in hushed tones, the kind of conversation that stops when someone walks into the room. But I didn't walk in. Instead, I sat at the top of the stairs and listened. "We have to call the police," Mom was saying. "She stole thousands of dollars, Michael. She let us destroy our relationship with Maya over lies." I know, Dad replied, his voice heavy. "But she's still our daughter. If we press charges, she could go to prison." "And what about Maya? What about what we put her through? What about the fact that we threw our own child out onto the street because we believed lies?" There was a long pause. Then Dad said, "I keep thinking about that look on Cassandra's face when she dropped that baggie on the table, like she was enjoying it. How did I not see that? How did I not know my own daughter was capable of this? I'd been wondering the same thing. How long had Cassandra been planning this? How long had she been stealing, lying, manipulating all of us while we remained completely oblivious?" I got dressed quietly and slipped out of the house before they could see me. I needed air, space, time to think without the weight of their guilt pressing down on me. I drove to Powell Butte, one of Portland's hidden gems, a nature preserve where I used to go as a teenager when I needed to clear my head. The trails were mostly empty on a Thursday morning. I found a bench overlooking the valley and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed occasionally with texts from friends who'd heard through the grapevine that something was going on with my family, but I ignored them all. What I couldn't ignore was the growing realization that this wasn't over. Cassandra hadn't just stolen money and lied about me. She'd shown a level of manipulation and cruelty that suggested this was who she really was, not some temporary lapse in judgment. And people like that don't just disappear quietly into the night. I was right. When I got home that afternoon, there were 2 police officers sitting in our living room with my parents. Detective Sarah Chen, a woman about my mother's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood up when I walked in. "Maya, I'm Detective Chen. I was hoping to speak with you about what happened with your sister." I sat down across from her, suddenly feeling like I was 12 years old again. "My parents told you everything?" "They told me about the theft, the false accusations, the planted evidence. But I'd like to hear your perspective." So I told her everything. From the moment I walked into that staged intervention to finding the evidence that proved Cassandra's guilt. Detective Chen took notes, asked clarifying questions, and maintained a professional sympathy that somehow made the whole story feel more real. "Maya," she said when I finished, "I want you to know that what your sister did wasn't just morally wrong. It was criminal. Identity theft, fraud, filing false reports, evidence tampering. These are serious charges." "What happens now?" Dad asked. "Well, we need to find her first. Do you have any idea where she might be staying?" None of us did. Cassandra had always been secretive about her social life, her friends, her activities outside of family gatherings. Now I understood why. Detective Chen left us with her card and a promise to be in touch as the investigation progressed. After she left, the 3 of us sat in uncomfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Mom spoke. "Maya, I need you to know something. Your father and we've been talking, and we realize this isn't just about Cassandra lying or stealing money. This is about us failing you as parents." I looked up at her, surprised by the directness of her statement. We should have known you better than to believe those accusations, she continued. We should have investigated before we acted. We should have given you the benefit of the doubt instead of assuming the worst. Dad nodded, his eyes still red from crying. We taught you your whole life that family sticks together, that we support each other no matter what. And then when you needed us most, we threw you away. Their words were what I'd wanted to hear a week ago, but now, sitting here in the aftermath of Cassandra's confession, I realized that their apologies couldn't fix what was broken. Trust, once shattered, doesn't just glue itself back together because someone says they're sorry. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. But I need you to understand that this changes things between us. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. We know, Mom said quietly. We don't expect you to forgive us right away. We just want to start earning back your trust. That conversation marked the beginning of what would be the most difficult period of my life. Not because of the drama with Cassandra, but because I was forced to rebuild my entire understanding of who my family was and who I was within that family. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, twice a week. She was recommended by Rachel, who'd been through her own family trauma a few years earlier. Dr. Martinez had this way of asking questions that made me examine things I'd never really thought about before. Maya, she said during our third session, you mentioned that you always felt like you had to be perfect to earn your parents' love. Can you tell me more about that? I shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair across from her desk. I don't know if it was about earning their love exactly. More like proving I deserved it. What's the difference? I thought about that for a long moment. Earning implies that love is transactional. Proving implies that love is conditional. And I guess I always felt like if I wasn't good enough, smart enough, successful enough, they might stop loving me. And how do you think that fear affected your relationship with Cassandra? That was the question that unlocked something I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. I think I enabled her. I covered for her when she messed up because I was afraid that if she failed too badly, it would reflect on me. And I was afraid that there wasn't room in my family for two imperfect daughters. Dr. Martinez nodded. That's a heavy burden for a child to carry. The responsibility for not just your own perfection, but for protecting your sister from the consequences of her choices. Over the weeks that followed, I began to see patterns I'd never noticed before. How I'd always been the one to smooth things over when Cassandra got in trouble. How I'd made excuses for her behavior, minimized her mistakes, even lied to my parents on her behalf. I'd thought I was being a good sister, but really, I'd been enabling someone who was already showing signs of the manipulation and deceit that would eventually destroy our family. Meanwhile, the investigation into Cassandra's whereabouts was ongoing. Detective Chen called every few days with updates. They'd traced her to a motel in southeast Portland, but she'd checked out before they could get there. Her credit cards were being used sporadically, always in different parts of the city, never for long enough to establish a pattern. She's smart, Detective Chen told me during one of our phone calls. She knows how to stay just ahead of us. But she'll make a mistake eventually. They always do. 3 weeks after the confrontation, she did. Cassandra tried to use Mom's credit card to book a flight to Los Angeles. The transaction was flagged immediately, and within hours, police were at PDX Airport waiting for her. She was arrested at the gate, just 20 minutes before her flight was supposed to board. The call came at 7 in the morning. Dad answered, and I could hear Detective Chen's voice through the phone from across the kitchen. We have her. She's in custody. The relief that washed over me was so intense I had to sit down. For weeks, I'd been looking over my shoulder, wondering when Cassandra might show up to cause more chaos. Now, finally, it was over. But it wasn't over. Not really. Because that afternoon, Cassandra called the house from jail. Maya, she said. When I answered, her voice small and scared in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "I need you to help me." I almost hung up. Almost. But something in her tone stopped me. "Help you what, Cassie?" "I need bail money. I need a lawyer. I need someone to believe that I'm not the monster everyone thinks I am." The audacity of it took my breath away. After everything she'd done, after all the lies and manipulation and cruelty, she was asking me to rescue her. Again. "Cassie," I said, my voice perfectly calm, "you stole thousands of dollars from our parents. You planted drugs in my car. You lied to destroy my reputation and my relationship with my family. You watched them kick me out of my home and said nothing. Why would I help you?" "Because I'm your sister," she said, and for the first time, I heard desperation creeping into her voice. "Because family is supposed to stick together." I laughed, a sound so bitter it surprised even me. Family is supposed to stick together. You're right. So where was that loyalty when you were setting me up to take the fall for your crimes? "Maya, please. I was scared. I was using and I owed money to some dangerous people. I panicked." "You weren't panicked when you planned that intervention. You weren't panicked when you planted evidence and rehearsed your lies. You were calculated. You were cruel. And you enjoyed watching me suffer." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "I was jealous." "Jealous of what?" "Everything. Your job, your independence, the way Mom and Dad bragged about you to their friends, the way everyone always expected great things from you while they waited for me to screw up. I wanted you to know what it felt like to be the disappointment, for once. And there it was. The truth behind all the lies, all the manipulation, all the pain she'd caused. She hadn't framed me because she was desperate or scared. She'd framed me because she wanted to destroy everything I'd worked for, everything I was proud of, everything that made me who I was. "Well, congratulations," I said. "You got what you wanted. I know exactly what it feels like to be a disappointment. Now, I know what it's like to have the people you love most look at you like you're garbage. I know what it's like to question everything about yourself because the people who are supposed to know you best believe you're capable of terrible things. Maya." But here's the difference between us, Cassie. When I was at my lowest point, when I had nothing and no one, I didn't try to destroy someone else to make myself feel better. I built myself back up, and I'm going to keep building until I'm so successful, so accomplished, so undeniably valuable that what you did to me becomes just a footnote in the story of everything I achieved. I hung up the phone and never spoke to my sister again. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, family therapy sessions, and slow, careful steps toward rebuilding trust with my parents. Cassandra was charged with multiple felonies and eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison. Mom and Dad had to testify against their own daughter, a process that aged them both visibly. But something unexpected happened during those difficult months. I discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. Not just emotionally, but practically. I'd been so focused on being the perfect daughter, the reliable one, the one who never caused problems, that I'd never really tested my own limits. Now, forced to navigate a complex legal system, manage my own emotional healing, and rebuild my relationships from the ground up, I found capabilities I didn't know I possessed. I could handle crisis. I could make hard decisions. I could stand up for myself even when it was uncomfortable. Most importantly, I learned that I didn't need my family's approval to know my own worth. For 23 years, I'd measured my value by how proud I made my parents, how well I compared to their expectations. But during those weeks when they'd believed the worst about me, when their opinion of me was based on lies, I'd continued to be exactly who I'd always been. Their judgment hadn't changed my character, my integrity, or my potential. That realization was more liberating than any apology they could offer. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that this experience, as traumatic as it was, had given me something invaluable: absolute clarity about who I was when everything else was stripped away. Most people go their whole lives without really testing their core identity, she told me. You've been forced to discover yours under the worst possible circumstances, and you've found that it's solid. She was right. I had found something solid, and I was ready to build something extraordinary on that foundation. The question was, what did I want to build? The answer came to me on a rainy Thursday morning in February, 6 months after Cassandra's arrest. I was sitting in a coffee shop near Portland State University, grading papers for the tutoring service I'd started to pay for therapy and save money for my own place. A young woman at the table next to me was crying quietly into her phone, and I couldn't help but overhear her conversation. "Mom, I can't come home for spring break," she was saying. "I know you miss me, but I can't afford the plane ticket and I need to work extra shifts to make rent." She paused, listening. "No, I'm not asking you for money. I know things are tight since Dad lost his job." Something about her determination, her refusal to burden her family despite her own struggles, reminded me of myself. After she hung up, I found myself walking over to her table. "I'm sorry for overhearing," I said, "but are you a student here?" She looked up, embarrassed. "Yeah, junior year, English major." "Are you looking for tutoring work? I run a small service and I could use someone with your background." Her name was Emma, and she became my first real employee. Not because I needed help with the workload, but because I recognized something in her that I was beginning to understand about myself. The hunger that comes from having to fight for everything you want, the resilience that develops when you have no safety net, the clarity that emerges when you realize you're the only person you can truly count on. Within 3 months, Emma and I had built the tutoring service into something much bigger. We weren't just helping students with homework. We were mentoring young people who, like us, were navigating life without the luxury of family support. We called it Foundation Academic Services, and our tagline was simple: building futures from the ground up. The business grew organically, driven by word of mouth and results. We worked with students who were the first in their families to attend college, kids aging out of foster care, young adults who'd been kicked out for being LGBTQ+, anyone who needed more than just academic help but life guidance from people who understood what it meant to start over. By the time Cassandra's trial began in earnest, I was running a team of 12 tutors and counselors, all of whom had their own stories of overcoming family rejection, financial hardship, or personal trauma. We weren't just a business, we were proof that when you strip away the safety nets and support systems that most people take for granted, you don't necessarily fall. Sometimes you learn to fly. The trial was harder than I'd expected. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the prosecution lay out the evidence of Cassandra's crimes, I found myself grieving not just for the sister I'd lost, but for the sister I'd never really had. The defense painted her as a victim of addiction, someone who'd made desperate choices while struggling with mental health issues. And maybe that was partly true. But it didn't change what she'd done to me, or the calculated cruelty she'd shown in doing it. When it came time for victim impact statements, the prosecutor asked if I wanted to speak. I'd been dreading this moment for months, but when I stood up and looked at Cassandra sitting at the defendant's table, I realized I had more to say than I'd thought. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "when my sister framed me for drug addiction and theft, she didn't just steal money from my parents or damage my reputation. She stole something much more valuable. My belief that family was unconditional, that the people who knew me best would never choose to believe lies over truth." I paused, looking directly at Cassandra. She was staring down at her hands, refusing to meet my eyes. But in trying to destroy me, she gave me something I never would have found otherwise. She forced me to discover who I really was when everything else was stripped away. She made me realize that I didn't need anyone's approval or support to be worthy of love and success. She taught me that the only person I could truly count on was myself. I could see my parents in the gallery, both crying silently. Dad's shoulders were shaking with suppressed sobs. Today, I run a business that helps young people who've been rejected by their families build new lives for themselves. I employ a dozen people who've all overcome their own struggles. I've helped hundreds of students not just succeed academically, but discover their own strength and resilience. None of that would have happened if I'd remained the person I was before Cassandra's betrayal, someone who needed other people's validation to feel valuable. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. So, while I can't thank my sister for what she did, I can tell you that I'm no longer the victim of her actions. I'm the author of my own story now, and it's a story about rising above betrayal, about building something meaningful from nothing, about proving that when people try to tear you down, you can choose to build yourself up instead. The judge sentenced Cassandra to 4 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 2.5 years. As they led her away in handcuffs, she finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Respect. Not love, not regret, but a grudging acknowledgement that I'd become someone she could no longer manipulate or control. After the trial, my relationship with my parents entered a new phase. The guilt and shame they carried over what had happened made them overly eager to support my business, to brag about my success, to overcompensate for their failure to believe in me when it mattered most. But I didn't want their overcompensation. I wanted something much harder to give. Genuine respect for the person I'd become, not just relief that I'd succeeded despite their failures. It took several more months of family therapy before we reached an understanding. Dr. Martinez helped us all see that rebuilding trust required more than apologies and good intentions. It required new patterns of behavior, new ways of communicating, and most importantly, a willingness to accept that our family dynamic had fundamentally changed. Maya isn't the same person she was before this happened, Dr. Martinez told my parents during one of our joint sessions. She's stronger, more independent, more self-reliant. She doesn't need your approval the way she used to. And that's not a bad thing. That's growth. Mom struggled with this more than Dad. She'd always been the emotional center of our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained connections. The idea that I might not need her in the same way anymore was difficult for her to accept. I just want things to go back to how they were, she said during one particularly difficult session. But they can't, I replied gently. How they were wasn't healthy, Mom. I was so afraid of disappointing you that I spent years covering for Cassandra's problems instead of addressing them. I was so invested in being the perfect daughter that I never learned to stand up for myself. And now you have, Dad said, his voice filled with something that sounded like pride. You've built something incredible, Maya. Something that's helping people. Something that's entirely yours. He was right. Foundation Academic Services had grown beyond my wildest expectations. We'd expanded to 3 locations, developed partnerships with local colleges and social service agencies, and created a scholarship program for students who couldn't afford our services. I'd been featured in Portland Business Journal, invited to speak at education conferences, and approached by investors interested in franchising our model. But the success that meant the most to me wasn't the business metrics or the media attention. It was the letters I received from former clients who'd gone on to graduate college, start careers, build families of their own. It was knowing that I'd helped other people discover their own strength and resilience. It was proof that something beautiful could grow from the ashes of betrayal. One letter in particular stood out. It was from Marcus, a young man who'd come to us after being kicked out of his home for being gay. He'd been failing his classes, struggling with depression, and convinced that he had no future. 2 years later, he'd graduated with honors and landed a job at a nonprofit that worked with LGBTQ+ youth. Maya, he wrote, you saved my life. Not just by helping me with my studies, but by showing me that being rejected by your family doesn't mean you're unworthy of love or success. You taught me that sometimes the people who try to break you end up being the ones who make you stronger. I hope someday I can help other kids the way you helped me. That letter arrived on the same day I received notification that Cassandra had been denied early parole. She'd been written up multiple times for fighting with other inmates and had refused to participate in the drug treatment program that was part of her sentence. The parole board noted her continued refusal to take responsibility for her actions and her lack of remorse for the harm caused to her victims. I felt nothing when I read the parole denial. Not satisfaction, not disappointment, just emptiness where my feelings for my sister used to be. She'd become a stranger to me, someone whose choices I couldn't understand or influence. The only emotion I could muster was a distant kind of sadness for the person she might have been if she'd chosen differently. That same week, I received a call that would change everything again. It was from Dr. Patricia Williams, the Dean of Portland State's School of Education. Maya, she said, I've been following your work with Foundation Academic Services, and I'm impressed by what you've built. I'm wondering if you might be interested in a partnership opportunity. She explained that the university was launching a new program to support first-generation college students, and they wanted to incorporate some of the mentoring and life skills components that had made our tutoring service so successful. We're not just looking for an academic partnership, she said. We're looking for someone who understands what it means to rebuild your life from scratch. Someone who can teach our students that setbacks don't define you, that you can create your own support system when the traditional ones fail. The opportunity was enormous. It would mean expanding our services to reach hundreds more students, developing curriculum that could be replicated at other universities, and establishing myself as a thought leader in the field of resilience-based education. But it would also mean something more personal. It would mean fully stepping into the identity I'd discovered in the aftermath of Cassandra's betrayal. It would mean owning my story, not as a victim of family dysfunction, but as someone who'd transformed pain into purpose. I accepted the partnership. The program launched in the fall, and I found myself standing in front of a lecture hall full of students, many of whom looked exactly like I had 2 years earlier, scared, uncertain, carrying invisible wounds that no one else could see. How many of you, I asked, have been told by someone you trusted that you weren't good enough, smart enough, or strong enough to succeed? Nearly every hand in the room went up. How many of you have had to start over, either because of circumstances beyond your control or because the people who were supposed to support you failed to do so? Again, almost every hand. Then you're exactly where you need to be, I said, because this program isn't about teaching you to succeed despite your struggles. It's about teaching you to succeed because of them. It's about understanding that the very experiences that have made you feel weak or broken are actually the sources of your greatest strength. I told them about Cassandra, about the night I was kicked out of my home, about building a business from nothing because I had to prove to myself that I was worth something. I told them about the difference between needing validation and knowing your own value, about the power that comes from realizing you don't need anyone's permission to be extraordinary. Your struggles don't make you damaged goods, I concluded. They make you prepared for a world that will test your resilience in ways that people with easier lives can't imagine. They make you the kind of person who doesn't just survive adversity, but transforms it into something beautiful. After the lecture, a young woman approached me. She was small, maybe 19, with the kind of guarded expression I recognized from my own mirror. Professor Collins, she said quietly, I'm Sarah. I was kicked out of my house last month because my parents found out I was dating a girl. I've been sleeping in my car and showering at the gym. I was thinking about dropping out because I don't know how I'm going to pay for school without their help. I looked at her, seeing myself 2 years earlier, and felt something shift inside me. This was why I'd survived Cassandra's betrayal. This was why I'd had to learn to stand on my own, to build something from nothing, to transform pain into purpose. "Sarah," I said, "let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to finish school. You're going to build a life that's entirely your own. And someday, you're going to help someone else who's standing exactly where you're standing right now, because that's what survivors do. We don't just overcome our circumstances. We use them to lift others up." She started crying then, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of hope. "How do you know?" she whispered. I smiled, thinking of all the students I'd worked with, all the lives that had been transformed, all the strength that had been discovered in the aftermath of rejection and betrayal. "Because I've been where you are," I said. "And I know what you're capable of, even if you don't know it yet." That night, I went home to my apartment, the first place I'd ever lived that was entirely mine, funded by my own work, decorated with my own choices. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened my laptop to work on the curriculum for the next day's class. But instead of writing about academic strategies or study skills, I found myself writing about transformation, about the difference between being a victim and being a survivor, about the power that comes from realizing that the people who try to break you can't actually touch who you really are. I wrote about Cassandra, not with anger or bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Not for what she'd done, but for what I'd become in spite of it, or maybe because of it. The story I was writing wasn't about revenge or justice or even forgiveness. It was about something more powerful than any of those things. It was about becoming so fully, authentically yourself that the opinions and actions of others become irrelevant to your sense of worth. It was about building something so beautiful from the ashes of betrayal that you almost forget how it started. Outside my window, Portland sparkled in the darkness, full of people fighting their own battles, making their own choices, building their own futures. Somewhere in that city was Sarah, probably still sleeping in her car, but now with hope instead of despair. Somewhere else were dozens of other students I'd worked with, all of them proof that family isn't just about blood, that support systems can be built rather than inherited, that strength can be discovered in the most unlikely places. And somewhere, in a prison cell 2 hours away, was Cassandra, still serving time for trying to destroy me, probably still unable to understand how her attempt at destruction had actually been the catalyst for my transformation. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't love her either. She'd become something else entirely, a character in a story that had ended up being about triumph rather than tragedy, about rising rather than falling, about becoming rather than being broken. The next morning, I would wake up and continue building the life I'd created from nothing. I would teach students who reminded me of myself. I would grow a business that existed to help people discover their own strength. I would continue to prove every single day that when someone tries to tear you down, you can choose to build yourself up instead. But for now, I sat in my own space, drinking my own tea, writing my own story, and marveling at how far I'd come from that night too. Years ago, when I'd walked out of my childhood home with nothing but a broken heart and a determination to survive, I'd done more than survive. I'd built something extraordinary, and I was just getting started. 2 years later, I was standing on the stage at the Oregon Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 1,500 educators, social workers, and community leaders who had come to hear me speak at the National Conference on Educational Resilience. The keynote address was titled, "From Betrayal to Breakthrough: How Crisis Can Become Your Greatest Teacher." But before I could begin my speech, my phone buzzed with a text that stopped me cold. It was from Detective Chen. "Maya, your parents' house was foreclosed on yesterday. They're staying at a motel on Powell Boulevard. Thought you should know." I stared at the message, my prepared speech suddenly feeling irrelevant. My parents, who had once owned a successful catering business and a beautiful home in Southeast Portland, were now homeless. The same parents who had thrown me out for crimes I didn't commit were now experiencing their own version of losing everything. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I felt no satisfaction in it. Just a hollow sadness for how completely our family had unraveled. I delivered my keynote that morning on autopilot, sharing the story I'd told dozens of times about transformation and resilience, about building something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. But my heart wasn't fully in it. Part of me was thinking about my parents, probably sitting in a cramped motel room, wondering how their lives had gone so wrong. After the conference, I drove to the motel Detective Chen had mentioned. It was one of those weekly rate places that catered to people between homes, with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered intermittently. I found their room number and knocked, not sure what I was going to say. Mom answered the door, and the shock on her face when she saw me was almost comical. She looked older, worn down by stress and circumstances. Behind her, I could see Dad sitting on the edge of one of two single beds, staring at a small television. "Maya," she whispered. "How did you—" "Detective Chen told me," I said. "Can I come in?" The room was cramped and smelled like disinfectant and despair. Their belongings were packed into a few suitcases and cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. It was a far cry from the comfortable home where they'd once sat in judgment of me. "How long have you been here?" I asked, settling into the room's single chair. 3 weeks, Dad said without looking away from the television. "We lost the house, the business, everything." Mom sat down on the other bed, her hands folded in her lap. "It started after Cassandra's arrest, the legal fees, the loss of business reputation when word got out about what she'd done. People stopped hiring us for events. We tried to keep going. But—" She gestured helplessly around the motel room. "We're too old to start over," Dad added, his voice flat with resignation. "Who's going to hire a 62-year-old caterer with no references and a criminal daughter?" I looked at these two people who had once held all the power in my life, who had once had the ability to make me feel worthless with a single disapproving look. Now they sat before me, broken, defeated, living in a motel room that probably cost more per week than I'd spent on groceries when I was building my business from nothing. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Mom shrugged. "We've applied for low-income housing, but the waiting list is months long. Your father's looking for work, but it's hard at his age. We're living on Social Security, and what little savings we have left." The conversation continued for another hour, with them detailing the series of financial disasters that had led them here. It was a familiar story in many ways, the same downward spiral I'd seen affect several of my students' families. Job loss leading to missed mortgage payments, leading to foreclosure, leading to the impossible task of rebuilding a life in your 60s with no safety net. When I left that day, I didn't make any promises or commitments. I just said I'd think about their situation. But as I drove back to my office, I found myself wrestling with a question I hadn't expected to face. What did I owe the people who had failed me so completely? The answer came to me gradually over the following weeks, as I threw myself deeper into my work with the university program. I was in the middle of a mentoring session with Sarah, the young woman who'd been kicked out for being gay, when she said something that crystallized my thinking. "Professor Collins," she said, "I know my parents hurt me badly, and I know they were wrong to reject me. But I still love them. I still hope that someday they'll realize what they lost and want to be part of my life again." I looked at this remarkable young woman who had not only finished her degree, but was now pursuing a master's in social work, who had transformed her pain into purpose just as I had. Her capacity for hope, despite everything she'd endured, reminded me of something I'd forgotten in my own journey. "Sarah," I said, "love isn't about what people deserve. It's about who we choose to be." That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my parents. I have a proposition for you, I told Dad when he answered. I'm expanding Foundation Academic Services into a full-service support center for displaced families. I need someone to run the food service component, preparing meals for our clients, catering our events, teaching cooking classes for people who need job skills. There was silence on the other end of the line. Are you offering us a job? Mom asked, having picked up the extension. I'm offering you a chance to rebuild, I said. Not your old life, but something new. Something that serves a purpose beyond profit. The job came with conditions. They would need to go through the same background checks as all our employees. They would need to complete training on trauma-informed care, since many of our clients had experienced family rejection or abuse. Most importantly, they would need to understand that this wasn't charity. It was an opportunity to earn their way back to stability through honest work. They started the following month, and watching them navigate their new roles was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Dad, who had once run his own successful business, now took direction from Emma, who had become my operations manager. Mom, who had always prided herself on her independence, had to learn to work as part of a team that included several young people who reminded her uncomfortably of me at that age, but they adapted. More than that, they began to understand our clients in a way I hadn't expected. When a teenage boy came in after being kicked out for refusing to follow his parents' career plans, Dad spent hours talking with him about resilience and starting over. When a single mother arrived with her 2 children after fleeing an abusive relationship, Mom took charge of making sure they had nutritious meals and someone to talk to. I never realized, Mom told me one afternoon as we watched Dad teaching a cooking class to a group of young adults aging out of foster care, how many families are broken, how many people are trying to rebuild from nothing. Now you do, I said, and now you're part of helping them. The transformation in my parents was gradual but unmistakable. They began to understand that their fall from grace wasn't just about Cassandra's crimes or their business failures. It was about the same forces that affected so many of our clients: the fragility of social and economic stability, the way crisis can expose weaknesses that have been hiding beneath the surface, the reality that anyone can find themselves starting over at any age. 6 months after they started working for me, we had a breakthrough moment. A young woman named Jessica came to us after being rejected by her religious family for having a child out of wedlock. She was 19, scared, and convinced that she had no future. Mom took her under her wing immediately, helping her navigate social services, find childcare, and enroll in our GED program. One evening, I overheard Mom talking to Jessica in the kitchen area of our center. I made the worst mistake of my life 3 years ago, Mom was saying. I chose to believe lies about my daughter instead of trusting the person I'd raised her to be. I threw her out of our home because I was scared and confused and I thought I was protecting our family. Jessica was listening intently, her baby sleeping in a carrier beside her. But Maya didn't let my failure define her, Mom continued. She built something beautiful from the worst moment of her life, and now she's given me and her father a chance to be part of that beauty, even though we didn't deserve it. Why did she do that? Jessica asked. After what you did to her, why would she help you? Mom was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, because she's become the person I always thought she was, but failed to see when it mattered most. Because she understands something I'm just learning, that helping people isn't about what they deserve. It's about who you choose to be. That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We began to talk more openly about what had happened, about the mistakes that had been made, about the long journey toward healing that we were all on. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was real. The biggest test came when Cassandra was released from prison after serving 2.5 years. She'd been granted parole with the condition that she complete a residential drug treatment program and maintain employment for 6 months. The parole officer contacted me as her only local family member to discuss her reintegration plan. I don't want to see her, I told the officer. I don't want her to know where I work or where I live. She made her choices, and now she has to live with the consequences. But Cassandra found me anyway. She showed up at our center one afternoon, looking older and harder than I remembered, but also strangely diminished. Prison had taken something out of her that I couldn't quite identify. "Maya," she said when I agreed to speak with her in my office, "I know you probably don't want to see me." "You're right, I don't." She sat down across from my desk, looking around at the photos on my walls, pictures of me with successful clients, awards from various organizations, newspaper clippings about the program's expansion. "You've done well for yourself," she said, and for the first time, there was no sarcasm or resentment in her voice. "I've worked hard," I replied. "I've built something meaningful. I heard about Mom and Dad, about them losing everything. And I heard you gave them jobs, that you helped them when they had nowhere else to go." I didn't respond, waiting to see where she was going with this. "I was hoping," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "that maybe you might consider doing the same for me." The request hung in the air between us. My sister, who had tried to destroy my life, was asking me to save hers. "Cassie," I said slowly, "what you did to me wasn't just stealing money or planting drugs. You tried to erase my identity. You tried to convince the people who knew me best that I was someone I wasn't. You took pleasure in watching me suffer." "I know," she whispered. "I was angry and jealous and high most of the time. I made terrible choices. You made calculated choices. There's a difference." She looked down at her hands. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, about who I was, about who I want to be now. And who is that? I don't know yet, but I know I can't be the person I was before. That person destroyed everything she touched." I studied my sister's face, looking for signs of the manipulation and deceit that had once come so naturally to her. What I saw instead was exhaustion, genuine remorse, and something that looked like fear. "If I were to consider giving you a chance," I said, "it would come with conditions that are non-negotiable. You would start at the bottom, doing whatever work we needed done. You would participate in counseling and drug testing. You would have no contact with our clients until you proved you could be trusted. And most importantly, you would have to earn every opportunity, every dollar, every moment of trust." "I understand." "Do you? Because this isn't about family loyalty or second chances. This is about whether you're willing to do the hard work of becoming someone worth believing in." She nodded, tears starting to flow. "I'll do whatever it takes. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking for it anyway." I looked at this woman who had once been my sister, who had caused so much pain, who was now asking me to believe in her redemption. And I realized that my answer would define not just her future, but who I was choosing to become. "You can start Monday," I said. "Minimum wage, probationary period, strict supervision. You'll be working in the warehouse, organizing donations, and preparing supply packages. If you can prove you're reliable and honest for 6 months, we'll reassess." The look of relief and gratitude on her face was so intense it was almost painful to witness. "Maya," she said, "I know I can never undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that what you've built here, the way you've helped Mom and Dad, the way you're helping all these people, it's incredible. You've become someone amazing." "I was always someone amazing," I said quietly. "You just couldn't see it because you were too busy trying to tear me down." That evening, I called Dr. Martinez to discuss my decision to hire Cassandra. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "After everything she put you through?" "I'm not sure about anything. When it comes to Cassie," I said, "but I'm sure about who I want to be. And the person I want to be doesn't leave people to drown just because they once tried to push me under." That's very generous of you. It's not generous. It's strategic. Every person who rebuilds their life becomes proof that redemption is possible. Every success story we create makes the world believe a little more in second chances, in transformation, in the possibility that people can change. 6 months later, Cassandra had not only proven herself reliable, but had shown an unexpected talent for connecting with our clients who were struggling with addiction. Her honesty about her own failures and the consequences she'd faced gave her a credibility that no amount of training could provide. She was working with a young man named David, who reminded me painfully of the person she used to be. Angry, manipulative, convinced that the world owed him something. I watched through my office window as she sat with him in our counseling room, their conversation intense and animated. Later, she knocked on my door. "David reminds me of myself," she said. "The way I used to blame everyone else for my choices, the way I thought I was entitled to take whatever I wanted." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth. That I spent 3 years in prison because I was too proud and too stupid to take responsibility for my actions. That I almost destroyed the best person in my life because I was jealous of her success instead of inspired by it." She paused, looking out the window at the courtyard where several of our clients were having lunch. "I told him that rock bottom isn't a place you fall to, it's a foundation you can build from, but only if you're willing to do the work." A year after that, Foundation Academic Services had grown into a network of 5 centers across Oregon and Washington. We'd helped over 2,000 people rebuild their lives after family rejection, financial crisis, or personal trauma. Our success rate was remarkable. 85% of our clients either completed their education goals or found stable employment within 18 months. But the number I was most proud of wasn't a statistic. It was the handful of people who had come to us broken and angry and convinced that the world had failed them, and who had left us as mentors and counselors and success stories themselves. People like Sarah, who now ran our LGBTQ+ support program. Like Marcus, who had started a scholarship fund for homeless youth. Like my parents, who had transformed their own experience of loss into a passion for helping others navigate crisis. And yes, like Cassandra, who had become one of our most effective addiction counselors, precisely because she understood the mindset of people who had hit bottom through their own choices. The final vindication came not from any external recognition or award, but from a letter I received on a Tuesday morning in spring. It was from a woman named Jennifer, whose teenage daughter had been kicked out of their home for being transgender. Jennifer had found our center online and driven 3 hours to bring her daughter to us. "Dear Maya," the letter read, "I want to thank you for saving my family. Not just my daughter, who is now thriving in college thanks to your program, but me. When I first contacted your center, I was angry and confused and convinced that my child was making a mistake that would ruin their life. Your staff didn't just help my daughter. They helped me understand that love means supporting your children in becoming who they're meant to be, not who you want them to be." She went on to describe how she and her daughter had reconciled, how they now volunteered together at LGBTQ+ events, how their relationship was stronger than it had ever been. "I know your story," she wrote. "I know that your own family failed you in ways that must have been devastating. But what you've built from that pain has saved countless families like mine. You've taken the worst thing that happened to you and transformed it into the best thing that could happen to people like us." That evening, I was working late in my office when Cassandra knocked on my door. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of tired smile that comes from a long but satisfying day. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting one of the cups on my desk. "Thanks." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "How did your session with the parents' support group go?" "Better than I expected. There were 12 parents there who've rejected children for various reasons. We spent 2 hours talking about fear, about how love can become controlling when we're scared of losing someone." She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where she'd once sat asking me for help. "Maya," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you think people can really change? I mean, fundamentally change who they are?" I considered the question, thinking about my own journey from desperate exile to successful entrepreneur, about my parents' transformation, from judgmental rejectors to compassionate helpers, about Cassandra's evolution from destructive manipulator to healing counselor. "I think people can change their actions," I said finally. "They can choose different behaviors, make different decisions, build different habits. Whether that constitutes changing who they are is a philosophical question I'm not qualified to answer." "But you believe in redemption." "I believe in growth. I believe in the possibility that our worst moments don't have to define us if we're willing to do the work of becoming better." She nodded slowly. "I'll never be able to undo what I did to you. I'll never be able to give you back those months of pain and uncertainty and rebuilding." "No, you won't. But maybe I can help make sure it doesn't happen to other people. Maybe I can use what I learned from being that person to help others avoid making the same mistakes." "Maybe you can." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two sisters who had found their way back to each other through the long, difficult path of accountability and forgiveness. Finally, Cassandra stood up to leave. At the door, she turned back. "Maya, I need you to know that what you've accomplished, the person you've become, the lives you've changed, it's extraordinary. And I'm proud to be your sister, even if I had to earn the right to say that." After she left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the city lights of Portland and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I had been a 23-year-old woman sitting in a motel room, convinced that my life was over, that I had lost everything that mattered. Now I was the CEO of an organization that had helped thousands of people rebuild their lives. I was a recognized expert on resilience and family reconciliation. I was someone who had taken the worst betrayal imaginable and transformed it into a mission of healing and hope. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Professor Collins, just wanted you to know that I got accepted to the PhD program at University of Washington. I'm going to study family systems and trauma recovery. Thank you for showing me that our struggles can become our superpowers." I smiled, thinking about all the young people I'd worked with who had discovered their own strength in the aftermath of rejection and loss. Each of them was proof that resilience isn't just about surviving adversity, it's about transforming it into purpose. The story that had begun with betrayal and exile had become a story about redemption and rebuilding. Not just for me, but for everyone whose life had been touched by the work we were doing. My parents were asleep in their small but comfortable apartment, tired from a day of feeding and counseling people who reminded them of their own journey from comfort to crisis to stability. Tomorrow they would wake up and continue the work of earning forgiveness, not through words but through service. Cassandra was probably at home in her studio apartment, reviewing notes for tomorrow's counseling sessions, preparing to help other people navigate the consequences of their choices. She would carry the weight of what she had done to me for the rest of her life, but she had learned to transform that weight into wisdom. And I was here, in the office of an organization built on the simple premise that when people try to break you can choose to build something beautiful instead. The girl who had been kicked out of her home for crimes she didn't commit was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge or bitterness or even forgiveness. It's transformation. It's taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to make sure better things happen to other people. It's proving, every single day, that no one has the power to define your worth except you. And it's understanding that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you the greatest gift of all, the absolute certainty of who you are when everything else is stripped away. That certainty, I had learned, was unshakable, and it was the foundation upon which everything else could be built. 5 years after that night in the motel room, I stood in the boardroom of the Marriott downtown, facing 12 investors who represented over $50 million in potential funding. The presentation I was about to give would determine whether Foundation Academic Services could expand nationally, reaching tens of thousands of families instead of the thousands we currently served. But as I looked at their expectant faces, I wasn't thinking about market penetration or revenue projections. I was thinking about the phone call I'd received that morning from the Oregon State Penitentiary. Cassandra had been stabbed by another inmate during a fight in the cafeteria. She was alive, but barely, and asking for me. Ms. Collins? The lead investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Chen, was looking at me with concern. Are you ready? To begin? I took a deep breath and clicked to my first slide. What if I told you that the most successful entrepreneurs aren't the ones who had the most advantages, but the ones who had to overcome the greatest obstacles? For the next 45 minutes, I walked them through our model. How we identified young people who had been rejected by their families. How we provided not just academic support but comprehensive life coaching. How we tracked their success rates over time. And most importantly, how we turned survivors into mentors who could help the next generation. Our retention rate is 94%, I explained, clicking to a slide showing our outcomes data. Compare that to traditional social services, which typically see 30 to 40% retention. The difference isn't just in our approach. It's in our understanding that people who have been forced to rebuild their lives from nothing have a level of determination that can't be taught. One of the investors, a man in his 60s with silver hair and skeptical eyes, leaned forward. Ms. Collins, your personal story is compelling, but how do we know this model can scale? We know it will work in different markets with different demographics? I had been expecting this question. Because pain is universal, Mr. Harrison. The specifics change. Some families reject children for being gay, others for choosing different careers, others for addiction or mental health issues. But the fundamental experience of having to rebuild your identity and your life from scratch? That's the same whether you're in Portland or Pittsburgh or Phoenix. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of the United States with dots representing potential expansion sites we'd identified. We've already piloted programs in 3 other cities, Denver, Austin, and Seattle. In each case, we've seen the same pattern: high demand, excellent outcomes, and most importantly, graduates who want to stay involved as mentors and staff. Victoria Chen nodded approvingly. What's your 5-year vision? 50 locations across the country, each one serving as a hub for family reconciliation and individual resilience training. But more than that, I want to change the conversation about family rejection. I want to make it socially unacceptable for parents to disown their children, and I want to make it clear that being rejected by your family doesn't mean you're broken. It means you have the potential to become extraordinary. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions about financial projections, operational challenges, and market analysis. By the time we concluded, I could tell they were impressed, but I wouldn't know their decision for another week. As I packed up my materials, Victoria approached me privately. Maya, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your family hadn't rejected you? If you'd never had to go through that experience? I considered the question carefully. I used to wonder about that a lot. But now I realize that wondering about alternative histories is a luxury I can't afford. The person I became because of that experience is someone I'm proud to be. The work I'm doing now exists because of that pain, not in spite of it. She nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why we're going to fund you. Because you're not just running a business, you're leading a movement. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes through Portland's afternoon traffic. I had called ahead, so the guards were expecting me. Walking through the prison's sterile corridors, I tried to prepare myself for seeing Cassandra in a hospital bed, but nothing could have prepared me for how small and fragile she looked. She was awake when I entered the room, her face pale against the white pillows. Multiple tubes connected her to various machines, and her left arm was in a cast. But her eyes were alert, and when she saw me, they filled with tears. "Maya, she whispered. "You came." I sat down in the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got stabbed in the stomach," she said, managing a weak smile. "Which technically I did." "What happened?" "Stupid fight over television channels. The other woman had a shiv. I should have walked away, but I've never been good at backing down from a fight." I looked at my sister, this woman who had once tried to destroy my life, and who was now lying in a prison hospital bed because she couldn't control her temper. "Cassie, you've got to find a way to survive in there. You've got less than a year left on your sentence." "I know, and I'm trying, Maya. I really am. I've been going to anger management classes, participating in the addiction recovery program, but some days it feels like I'm fighting against who I've always been." "Who have you always been?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. "Angry, jealous, someone who destroys things instead of building them." "That's who you were. It doesn't have to be who you are." "How do you know?" I thought about the investors I'd just met with, about the expansion plans that would help thousands more families, about the letter I'd received that morning from a young man in Seattle who credited our program with saving his life after his parents disowned him for his political beliefs. Because I've seen what happens when people decide to become different than they were. I've seen teenagers who were addicted to drugs become counselors who help other kids get clean. I've seen parents who rejected their children become advocates for family acceptance. I've seen people who were convinced they were worthless discover that they're actually extraordinary. And you've seen me trying to change. Yes. And I've seen you succeeding, even when you stumble. She reached out with her uninjured hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. "Maya, I need to tell you something. The day you hired me, at the foundation, I was planning to kill myself." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" I'd been out of prison for 2 weeks, living in a halfway house with women who reminded me of the worst parts of myself. I couldn't find work, couldn't find a place to live, couldn't see any future that didn't involve going back to drugs or back to prison. I had everything planned out. I squeezed her hand, not knowing what to say. "But then you gave me that job. Not because you'd forgiven me, not because you thought I deserved it, but because you believed I could become someone worth believing in. And for the first time in my life, I had a reason to try." "Cassie, I know I hurt you in ways that can never be undone. I know I stole years of peace and security from you, but I also know that the work you're doing now, the lives you're saving, it wouldn't exist without what happened between us." I stared at her, this woman who had been my tormentor and was now my employee, my sister, my reminder of how far we had both traveled. "Are you saying I should thank you for trying to destroy my life?" "No. I'm saying that maybe the worst things that happen to us don't have to be the end of our story. Maybe they can be the beginning of something better." I stayed with Cassandra for another hour, until the guards told me visiting time was over. As I walked back through the prison corridors, I thought about resilience, about redemption, about the strange ways that pain can become purpose. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Victoria Chen. The subject line read, "Congratulations, we're in." The funding had been approved. $50 million to expand foundation academic services nationwide. The first new locations would open in 6 months, and within 5 years, we would be operating in every major city in the country. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and reading through the contract details, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Not the satisfaction of overcoming obstacles or the pride of achieving goals, but simple happiness about the future. My phone rang. It was Sarah, calling from Seattle where she was finishing her PhD. "Professor Collins, I just saw the news about your funding. This is incredible. It is pretty amazing, I agreed. And Sarah, I want you to know that you're going to be part of the expansion. I'm offering you the position of Regional Director for the Pacific Northwest. There was silence on the other end of the line, then the sound of crying. Sarah, are you okay? I'm perfect, she said through her tears. 3 years ago, I was sleeping in my car and thinking about dropping out of school. Now you're offering me the chance to run programs that will help thousands of people like me. It's like a dream. It's not a dream. It's what happens when people who've been knocked down decide to build something beautiful instead of staying down. After we hung up, I walked to my office early, wanting to savor the quiet before the day began. The building was empty except for the security guard, and I used my key to let myself into the suite that housed Foundation Academic Services. I walked through the main workspace, past the cubicles where our counselors worked with clients, past the conference room where we held our weekly staff meetings, past the kitchen where my parents prepared meals for families who were rebuilding their lives. In my office, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. There was an email from Marcus, the young man who had started the scholarship fund for homeless youth. He was writing to tell me that his program had just received a major grant from a national foundation. Maya, his email read, I keep thinking about what you told me when I first came to your center. You said that being rejected by your family doesn't make you broken, it makes you prepared. You were right. Everything I went through prepared me for this work. Every night I spent sleeping on the streets taught me something about survival that I now use to help other kids. Every moment of feeling worthless taught me how to recognize worth in people who can't see it in themselves. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at Portland waking up around me. Somewhere in this city were young people who had been kicked out of their homes, who were sleeping in their cars or on friends' couches, who were convinced that their lives were over. In a few hours, some of them would walk through our doors, and we would begin the process of helping them discover that rejection wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of their transformation. The intercom buzzed. Maya? It was Tom, our security guard. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. I frowned. We weren't officially open yet, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Send them up. A few minutes later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with a woman I didn't recognize. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of desperate look I'd learned to associate with parents who had made terrible mistakes. Ms. Collins, my name is Patricia Williams. I drove here from Sacramento because I heard about your work and I need your help. I invited her in and offered her coffee, studying her face as she composed herself. She had the look of someone who hadn't slept in days. Ms. Collins, 2 weeks ago, I kicked my 17-year-old daughter out of our house. She told me she was pregnant, and I was so angry, so disappointed, that I said things I can never take back. I told her she was a disgrace to our family. I told her not to come back until she was ready to make better choices. I felt my stomach tighten. This was the other side of the stories I heard every day. The parents who made the choice to reject their children who had to live with the consequences of that decision. Where is your daughter now? I asked. I don't know. She's been staying with friends, but yesterday her best friend called me and said she's talking about dropping out of school, about giving up. She won't take my calls. Patricia Williams began to cry. The kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from someone who has realized they've made an irreversible mistake. Ms. Collins, I've read about your story. I know what happened to you with your family, and I know that you've built something incredible from that experience. I'm praying that you can help me fix what I've broken. I looked at this woman, this mother who had done to her daughter exactly what my parents had done to me. The difference was that she had realized her mistake in weeks instead of months, and she was here asking for help instead of waiting for her daughter to prove her wrong. Patricia, I said gently, I can't make your daughter forgive you. I can't undo the words you said or the pain you caused. But I can help you understand what she's going through and I can give you tools to begin earning back her trust. Anything. I'll do anything. The first thing you need to understand is that this isn't about her making better choices. This is about you learning to love your daughter unconditionally, even when her choices aren't the ones you would make. Over the year. Next 2 hours, I walked Patricia through the same process I'd been through with my own parents. I helped her understand that love isn't about control, that supporting your child doesn't mean approving of every decision they make, that family is supposed to be the safe place people can come to when the rest of the world is harsh. Your daughter is going to have a baby, I told her. That's not a mistake to be ashamed of. It's a life to be celebrated. She's going to need her mother now more than ever, but she's not going to trust you until you prove that you're capable of being the mother she needs. How do I do that? You start by admitting that you were wrong. Not just about kicking her out, but about the fundamental way you've been thinking about her choices. You start by making it clear that your love for her isn't conditional on her living up to your expectations. When Patricia left that morning, she had a plan for reconnecting with her daughter and a commitment to attend our family reconciliation workshops. She also had something else: hope that the damage she'd done could be repaired. That afternoon, I received a call from the prison. Cassandra was out of the hospital and back in her cell, but she wanted to ask me something. "Maya," she said when I accepted the call, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about people becoming different than they were. What about it? I want to be part of what you're doing. I know I can't undo what I did to you, but I want to help other people avoid making the same mistakes I made. Cassie, you're still in prison for another 8 months. I know, but I've been talking to the chaplain here about starting a program for inmates who have damaged relationships with their families. A lot of women in here have children who won't speak to them, parents who have disowned them, siblings who want nothing to do with them." I felt something shift in my chest. What kind of program? Something that helps them understand the impact of their choices, that teaches them how to take real responsibility for the harm they've caused, that prepares them for the hard work of earning forgiveness when they get out. And you want to lead this program? I want to try. I know I'm not qualified. I know I'm still figuring out how to be a better person myself. But I also know what it's like to be someone who destroys the people they love. Maybe that gives me something to offer. I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the expansion plans, about the thousands of families we would soon be serving, about the need for people who understood both sides of family rejection, the rejected and the rejectors. "Cassie, if you can get approval from the prison administration to start this program, Foundation Academic Services will provide funding and materials, and when you get out, there will be a job waiting for you." "Really?" "Really, but not because you're my sister, because you're someone who has learned to transform pain into purpose." 6 months later, I stood in the ballroom of the Seattle Marriott, addressing an audience of 500 people who had gathered for the first annual National Conference on Family Resilience and Reconciliation. The keynote address was being broadcast live to our other locations, reaching thousands more people across the country. 5 years ago, I began. I was a 23-year-old woman who had lost everything: my family, my home, my sense of identity. I was sitting in a motel room, convinced that my life was over, that I would never recover from the betrayal I had experienced. I paused, looking out at the audience. In the front row, I could see my parents, now in their mid-60s, who had driven up from Portland for the conference. Sarah was there too, along with Marcus and dozens of other former clients who had become staff members, advocates, and leaders in their own right. I was wrong, I continued. My life wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you'll ever do. I clicked to my next slide, which showed a map of the United States with dots representing our current locations. Today, Foundation Academic Services operates in 23 cities across the country. We've helped over 15,000 young people rebuild their lives after family rejection. More importantly, we've facilitated over 3,000 family reconciliations. The audience erupted in applause, but I held up my hand to continue. But the number I'm most proud of isn't on any of these slides. It's the number of people who have transformed their pain into purpose, who have taken the worst experiences of their lives and used them to help others facing similar challenges. I clicked to the final slide, which showed a simple quote. The most beautiful people I've known are those who have known trials, have known struggles, have known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. That quote, I said, is from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it captures everything I've learned about resilience, about growth, about the incredible capacity humans have to transform suffering into service. I looked out at the audience one more time, thinking about the journey that had brought me here, about the young woman who had once sat in a motel room convinced that her life was over. To everyone here who has been rejected, abandoned, or betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, your story is not over. Your pain is not meaningless. Your struggle is not in vain. You have within you the capacity to transform your worst moments into your greatest purpose. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. As I left the stage, I thought about Cassandra, who was now running family reconciliation programs in 3 different prisons. I thought about my parents, who had become 2 of our most effective family counselors. I thought about all the young people we had served who were now serving others. Most of all, I thought about the power of choice, the choice to become bitter or better, the choice to be defined by what happens to you or by how you respond to what happens to you, the choice to let your pain become your purpose. That night, alone in my hotel room, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not a business plan or a grant proposal, but a book. The story of how betrayal had become breakthrough, how rejection had become resilience, how the worst thing that ever happened to me had become the foundation for the best work I would ever do. I titled it, Building from Broken, How Crisis Becomes Your Greatest Teacher. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do with your pain is share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.